So what we want to do today is just kind of take the big ideas out of especially 6.2 and 6.3 and just kind of, talk about them and what that looks like just kind of in a nutshell. And so we're really going to focus on these policies we were talking about, fiscal and monetary policy. Now, before we do that, we need to make sure we review some of the key ideas within this model because understanding the model itself will make the policies make so much more sense, I promise. So let's take a look at the model. Now remember, our axes are labeled a little bit different. We have price level on our y-axis and our real GDP on our x. So first we have our aggregate demand curve, and remember our aggregate demand is just the total value of all goods and services that are demanded within our economy at any price level. We have our short run aggregate supply, which is the total value of all goods and services produced in our economy at any price level. And we said that the point where those two intersect represents our short run equilibrium. Wherever those two intersect represents where our economy is producing right now. We also had a third curve that we put in there as well, though. It's this vertical green line we called our long run aggregate supply curve. Now, this is the total value of all goods and services that we have the ability to produce whenever we're being fully efficient with our resources. Or what we would say is that we're being sustainable. It's like the sustainable level of output given the resources we have available within our economy. Now, we said the point where all three of these curves intersect is known as our long run equilibrium. And remember, we had said that this point here is our goal. So let's talk about a couple different scenarios about how this model might look for us. We obviously talked about this first one about our economy being at our potential. So whenever we're at our potential, I want to draw our attention to that equilibrium, point number 1 there. So at this equilibrium, again, we said it's the point at which our aggregate demand intersects with our short run aggregate supply, but it's also intersecting with our long run aggregate supply. So what exactly does that mean? Well, again, looking at this model, what that means is that we are currently operating wherever our aggregate demand curve and our short run aggregate supply curve intersect. So we're at an output that's there at that point 2 and at a price level that's there at that point 3. And what this represents is that at this point where we're operating right now, that the value of all goods and services demanded within our economy is equal to the value of all goods and services produced within our economy. But the thing is, if you notice, this output is also equal to our potential. And we said that this was our goal. Whenever we're at our potential, we're saying that where we're operating right now is fully efficient and it's sustainable for our economy in the long run. And that's our goal. That's where we want to be. Now, what happens if we're at a point instead where that point number 1, that intersection of our short run aggregate supply and our aggregate demand, remember that represents where we're currently at in the short run, where our aggregate demand and our short run aggregate supply curve intersect. But what happens if you notice there it's to the left of the green curve? Well, because our current GDP, right, so that point number 2, since that current GDP is less than our potential, our output, that would be point number 3, we notice that we are to the left of our long run aggregate supply. So that means our economy is producing at a real GDP that's below its potential. Because if you notice that point on our x-axis, number 2, is less than point number 3 on our x-axis. So that means our economy is in a recession because our output at our equilibrium, so YE, is less than our output at our potential, YP. Or like we said, that point number 2 along our x-axis is less than point number 3. But what about the other direction? What if we're above our potential? So what we see again is that our short run equilibrium, that point number 1, that intersection there, is our aggregate demand curve intersecting with our short run aggregate supply is where we're currently operating. But since it's to the right of our green line, we say that our output, our current output, is greater than our potential, right? That potential that's shown by our long run aggregate supply. So our economy is currently producing above its potential. Now, again, we said that we can do this for a short period of time, but we can't do it across the long run. It's not sustainable in the long run. It is for a short period of time. It is for the short run, but not for the long run. And so this means our economy is experiencing that rapid expansion, wherever that current equilibrium, YE, is greater than YP, our potential. Or you can see our point number 2 is further along our x-axis than point number 3, which is our potential. So getting back to the connection of, well, what about these situations where we're not at our equilibrium? What exactly do? We need to make sure we remember the relationship between our real GDP and our aggregate demand. So if you remember, our aggregate demand, it represents the value of all goods and services demanded by anyone in our economy. And it doesn't really matter who's demanding those. It could be consumers that are demanding it. It could be businesses. It could be the government who's demanding goods and services. It could be people overseas that are demanding those goods and services, right? So our aggregate demand is made up of everybody who's demanding stuff within our economy. Now, at the same time, if you remember our real GDP, or that Y, we find that by adding everything together that is purchased within our economy. Think like demanded, everything that's demanded as well. So it doesn't matter who is purchasing that, whether it's consumers, businesses, government, or overseas. And if you notice, that sounds really familiar from up above. So what I want you guys to see is that our aggregate demand and our real GDP, we can't say that they're technically the same things, but they are extremely closely related. And really the best way to think about this is that they will always move together. Meaning that like if GDP is increasing, it's because our aggregate demand increased. Or if our aggregate demand decreases, it's going to cause our real GDP to decrease. They always move together. And again, we can think about this because of that formula for our GDP equation, right? That Y, or our GDP, is equal to C plus I plus G plus X sub N. Or GDP is equal to consumer spending plus investment spending plus government spending plus our net exports. So again, looking at this equation a little bit more closely, we have to think about what would happen if we want our real GDP to change. So let's suppose that we're in a recession and we want our real GDP to increase. Well, simple math tells us that if we want the Y to increase, we also need something on the right-hand side of our equation to increase as well. So if we want Y to increase, something else has to be moving. Now remember, since GDP and aggregate demand are very closely related, an increase in GDP is caused by an increase in aggregate demand. So our aggregate demand curve is moving as our real GDP is moving. So if you notice, if maybe we have an increase in Y, that is either going to be caused by an increase in consumer spending, or maybe it's caused by an increase in investment spending, or maybe it's caused by an increase in government spending. It could even be net exports, but really the consumer, investment, and government are the ones that have the biggest influence on our economy. But think about it to the other direction. What if we want our GDP to slow? What if we want that to decrease? Well, again, if we want our Y to decrease, we're going to need something on the right-hand side of the equation to also decrease, right? So again, our aggregate demand as a whole is going to decrease. Why? Well, because either the amount demanded by consumers is going to decrease. Maybe it's the amount from businesses, investment spending that's decreasing. Maybe it's government spending. So anything demanded from the government's decreasing. And so no matter what, we end up seeing is that our GDP is being influenced by what's going on the right-hand side of our equation. If the amount that's being demanded by consumers or businesses or the government is changing, that is then going to change our GDP.